The heat clung to Helen's skin like a wet cloth as she stepped off the curb, grocery list folded tight in her palm. The air in Savannah felt thicker than usual, shimmering above the pavement, making the houses at the end of the street look like a mirage. She told herself it was just a short walk to the market. Nothing she hadn't done 100 times when the car wasn't available. But halfway down the block, her chest tightened, her legs turned to rubber, and the sidewalk seemed to tilt under her feet. She reached for a fence post, fingers trembling, and realized with a hard, cold clarity that there was no one to call who wouldn't sigh first. A car rolled by slowly, music humming from inside, and for a moment she thought it might stop, that someone, Talvez, would lower the window and ask if she was all right. Instead, it kept going, taillights shrinking, leaving her alone with the buzzing cicadas and her own ragged breathing. Her shirt clung to her back, sweat soaking through the cotton as she tried to steady herself and not draw attention. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth, a trick she once read to keep from crying in public. The world narrowed to the burning in her lungs and the sting in her eyes as she forced herself not to collapse. Helen glanced back toward home, measuring the distance like a punishment she had given herself. The grocery bags she had imagined carrying back were suddenly replaced by the weight of every year she had spent depending on someone else's schedule. For a second, she considered calling Mark at work, but she could already hear his voice, annoyed, rushed, reminding her of how busy he was. She pictured her children's names on her phone, each one with a life somewhere far away, each conversation starting with, "Mom, I don't have much time." Her fingers stayed frozen at her sides, the phone a heavy rectangle in her pocket, as if reaching for it would prove how helpless she really was. Her breathing slowed, but her legs still trembled like she had run a marathon instead of walking 3 blocks. She turned around, each step back toward the house feeling smaller, like the world was quietly shrinking around her. The market disappeared from her plans as if it had only been a dream she had briefly believed. The sun glared off passing windshields, and Helen saw her reflection in one of them, flushed, tired, older than she felt inside. She looked away quickly, afraid of the woman looking back at her, afraid of how much of her life seemed to be behind her. When she finally reached her front steps, her hand shook as she grabbed the rail and pulled herself up. The house greeted her with its familiar peeling paint and sagging porch, as if it, too, carried its own exhaustion. Inside, the ticking clock sounded louder than usual, each second a reminder of time sliding past unnoticed. She dropped her keys on the table and leaned against the wall, feeling the cool paint against the back of her head. In that sudden stillness, it hit her that she had almost fainted in the street and had no idea how she would have gotten home if she had. Her heart still beat too fast as she sank onto a chair at the kitchen table, staring at the empty countertop. No groceries, no dinner plan, no small sense of accomplishment that usually followed her errands. She could already imagine Mark's face when he realized there was nothing ready, the silent question hanging in his eyes. It wasn't just about food. It was about the job she had assigned herself long ago, the one that never came with a paycheck or a day off. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she could not keep doing it anymore. Helen closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the ache in her chest, deeper this time, slower. The memory of the flashing pavement and the spinning sidewalk replayed in her mind like a warning she didn't yet know how to read. Maybe it was age, maybe it was stress, maybe it was nothing, she tried to tell herself. But beneath all the explanations, something colder whispered a different question. What if it was her life catching up to her? She opened her eyes to the same small kitchen, and yet it felt like the walls had moved closer while she was gone. By the time Mark got home, the sky had turned the color of watered-down milk, and the house smelled only of cleaning products. Helen stood at the counter, hands resting on an empty cutting board, a pot of water simmering without purpose on the stove. She heard the front door open, the familiar thud of his briefcase dropping onto the hall table. Every sound of his arrival felt rehearsed, like they'd been performing the same scene for years without ever changing a line. Her throat tightened as she realized she had nothing prepared and no good reason that would sound acceptable to him. He walked into the kitchen, loosened his tie, and looked at the stove with a frown that barely needed words. "No dinner yet?" he asked, not harshly, but with that sharp edge of disappointment that cut deeper than shouting. Helen opened her mouth, thinking of the heat, the dizziness, the way the world had blurred around her. Instead, she heard herself say, "I didn't make it to the store," as if that were all, as if she had simply forgotten. His sigh filled the room, heavy and familiar, settling into the corners like dust. "I had a long day, Helen," he said, pulling a frozen meal from the freezer, the box crinkling loudly in his hands. He moved around her, opening drawers and cabinets, as if she were part of the furniture, taking up space. I can't keep worrying about whether there's going to be dinner when I get home, he added, voice low and clipped. She watched him, words stuck behind her teeth, feeling smaller with every motion he made. Every sentence seemed to confirm that her value here was measured in prepared meals and folded laundry. She wanted to say, I almost collapsed in the street today, but the moment for that had already slipped past. The conversation had taken its usual shape, settled into its usual grooves, like water finding the same path downhill. Helen felt the urge to explain, to defend herself, to insist that something was wrong, that she was scared, but years of swallowing her needs had taught her another reflex: stay quiet, smooth things over, do better tomorrow. So she nodded instead, accepting a blame that went far beyond uncooked food. As the microwave hummed and rotated his dinner, the kitchen filled with a synthetic smell that didn't quite feel like home. Helen stood by the sink, running water over a plate that didn't need washing, just to have something to do with her hands. Mark scrolled through his phone at the table, the blue light lighting his face while his fork tapped impatiently. There were whole worlds happening in that small screen that had nothing to do with her, nothing that required her. The silence between them grew thick, stitched together by the soft buzz of the microwave and the distant whir of the ceiling fan. Finally, he broke the quiet with a half-hearted attempt at normalcy, asking about the kids in a neutral tone. She gave short updates, their son's new project at work, their daughter's busy schedule, the usual excuses for their absence. It felt like reading headlines from someone else's life, not stories she was truly inside anymore. Mark grunted, nodded, then drifted back into his phone, as if the conversation had fulfilled a small obligation. Helen realized that even when they talked, nothing of her actually crossed the table. When he finished eating, he stood up, dropped the plastic tray in the trash, and kissed her forehead in a distracted way. Try to get to the store tomorrow, he said, already halfway out of the room. His footsteps faded down the hall, toward the living room and the TV, toward a world where she existed mostly as background. She stayed in the kitchen, the empty plate in the drying rack, reflecting the overhead light. In that quiet, she noticed a new kind of loneliness, one that came not from being alone, but from not being seen at all. The next morning, the house was wrapped in a soft gray light, the kind that made everything look gentler than it felt. Helen sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going lukewarm in her hands, phone face up beside it. Her fingers hovered over her daughter Emily's name, the familiar ache of missing her spreading in her chest. She told herself she just wanted to hear her voice, to know how she was doing. But it was more than that. She wanted, desperately, for someone to ask how she was doing and actually wait for the answer. She pressed call, listening to the ringing, each tone stretching longer than the last. When Emily finally picked up, there was noise in the background, voices, traffic, a life moving quickly. Hey Mom, I'm on my way to a meeting, can we be quick? Her daughter's voice came through, bright and breathless. Helen smiled automatically, even though Emily couldn't see it. A trained response from years of wanting to sound fine. Of course, sweetheart, she said, folding her free hand around the mug, as if it could steady her. They covered the basics first, the surface-level questions that filled most of their conversations. How was work? How was the weather? Had she talked to her brother lately? Helen answered, painting her days with broad strokes, leaving out the fainting feeling and the empty stove. She didn't want to worry her daughter, didn't want to sound needy or heavy or like a problem to solve. She knew Emily carried enough weight of her own in a city far away, in a life that rarely had space for stillness. At one point, Helen tried to slip something real into the spaces between words. I haven't been feeling very well, she began, her voice quieter, searching for a tender opening. But Emily's response came fast, layered over her words before they fully settled. I'm sorry, Mom. This week has been insane. I barely have time to sleep, she said, half laughing, half exhausted. Helen swallowed the rest of her sentence, letting it dissolve into the steam rising from her untouched coffee. She listened as her daughter listed deadlines and presentations, names of coworkers and projects she barely recognized. There was pride in Helen's chest, of course, a fierce love for the woman her girl had become. But beneath the pride, a different feeling stirred, a distance that seemed measured not in miles, but in shared moments. She realized she knew more about Emily's schedule than about her inner world, her fears, her secret joys, and she wondered what Emily knew about hers, if anything at all. Anyway, I really have to run, Emily said suddenly, the sound of a door opening loud through the speaker. We'll talk more on the weekend, okay? Love you, Mom. The goodbye was quick, a familiar closing line and a conversation that never quite reached the places Helen longed for. I love you too, Helen replied, but the call had already ended, leaving the words hanging in the kitchen air. She stared at the dark screen, her own reflection faint and blurred, like someone she was still trying to recognize. She set the phone down and listened to the quiet that followed, so complete it almost rang in her ears. The house seemed to exhale around her, settling back into its usual rhythm of humming appliances and distant traffic. Helen realized that Emily's life was expanding while hers felt like it was slowly shrinking to the size of these walls. The call had given her a momentary warmth, a flicker of connection, but it faded too quickly. In the silence that remained, the question from the day before returned, sharper now. Who would be there if she truly needed help? Later that afternoon, Helen stood by the living room window, watching cars glide past like small self-contained worlds. Each driver moved with a kind of unthinking confidence, starting and stopping, turning left or right without asking anyone's permission. She imagined what it must feel like to simply decide and go, without aligning your steps with someone else's plans. Her reflection in the glass merged with the passing traffic, a woman caught between motion and stillness. A thought surfaced quietly, stubborn and unwelcome. She had never once been behind the wheel. It wasn't as if she had never had the chance, she reminded herself, fingers twisting the edge of the curtain. Back when she was young and newly married, Mark had said there was no rush, that he liked driving her places. Then the babies had come, and there had always been something more urgent, more important, more pressing than lessons. Over the years, the story had written itself. She didn't drive because she didn't need to, because someone else always could. It had sounded harmless, even convenient, until yesterday, when the world had spun and no one had been there. She walked to the hall closet and opened the door, staring at the row of shoes lined up on the floor. The same sneakers she wore on her failed walk sat beside Mark's polished work shoes, their laces neat and sure. Above them, on a hook, hung the car keys, cold metal glinting under the dim light. Helen reached up and let her fingertips brush against them, a soft clink echoing in the small space. The contact sent a strange jolt through her, as if she had touched not keys, but a boundary. The truth pressed in on her from all sides. She was 50 years old and completely dependent on other people to leave her own neighborhood. If Mark didn't feel like going somewhere, she didn't go. If the kids couldn't visit, she stayed here, waiting for the phone to ring or for a text to appear. If her body betrayed her on a hot sidewalk, she had no way to rescue herself. The realization didn't just sting. It felt like a quiet humiliation that had stretched over decades. She sat on the bottom stair, car keys still swaying lightly above her, and tried to trace the moment she had given up on the idea. Maybe it had been when they moved to Savannah and everything felt new and overwhelming. Maybe it was when the kids were small and she'd convinced herself her world could fit inside school routines and grocery lists. Maybe it had never been a single moment at all, but 1,000 tiny choices to let fear dress itself up as practicality. Either way, the result was the same. She had built a life that required her to wait for someone else to start the engine. A long, shaky breath left her chest as she whispered the words she'd never dared say out loud. I don't know how to drive, she said to the empty hallway, the confession bouncing softly off the walls. It sounded absurd, embarrassing, like something she should have outgrown decades ago. Still, there was a strange relief in admitting it, even if only to herself, like a knot loosening in the dark. For the first time, the sentence didn't feel like a fact of her identity, but like a question. She closed the closet door gently, the keys disappearing from sight, but not from her mind. As she walked back to the living room, the house felt slightly tilted, as if her perspective had shifted by a few crucial degrees. The usual afternoon chores waited for her, laundry and dishes and a list of small responsibilities. But the image of herself on that sidewalk, dizzy and powerless, kept replaying like a scene from a movie she couldn't pause. Something in that scene had cracked the story she'd always told herself, and through the crack, a harsh light was beginning to pour in. That night, long after Mark had fallen asleep with the television murmuring in the background, Helen lay awake in the dark. The ceiling above her was just a faint outline, but her mind was painfully bright, replaying the last 2 days. The heat on the sidewalk, the silence at the dinner table, the rushed call with Emily, the feel of the car keys against her fingers. Each memory felt like a small push, and together they formed a pressure she couldn't ignore anymore. It was as if life itself were whispering that something had to change, whether she was ready or not. She turned onto her side, facing away from Mark, listening to his soft snore and the distant hum of the air conditioner. For years, she had measured her days by his needs and their children's schedules, fitting herself in the leftover spaces. It wasn't that she regretted loving them or caring for them. That part of her life had meaning. But she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, she had disappeared. Now, in the quiet of this room, the cost of that disappearance felt suddenly unbearable. Images began to form in her mind, not of what had happened, but of what could exist beyond this. She pictured herself gripping a steering wheel, knuckles tight with fear, but still moving forward down a street. She imagined the radio low, the window cracked open, the decision of where to go resting entirely in her hands. There was fear in the picture, yes, a deep, raw terror of failure and judgment and late beginnings, but there was also something else, a pulse of possibility, a flicker of freedom she had never allowed herself to want. A voice inside her, the same one that had kept her safe all these years, whispered all the reasons not to try. You're too old, people will laugh, Mark will be annoyed. What if you fail? What if you crash? What if you prove every fearful thought right? She listened, heart racing, and realized that voice sounded less like wisdom and more like a prison guard. Helen pushed the covers back slowly and sat on the edge of the bed, feet touching the cool floor. She felt the familiar pull to lay back down, to promise herself she'd think about it another time. Instead, she walked quietly into the hallway, guided by the faint light seeping under the bathroom door. She stopped in front of the mirror, barely able to see her own reflection, but feeling the weight of her gaze. In that dim light, she whispered, "I'm allowed to start now," as if saying it could make it true. The next morning, her hands trembled slightly as she opened the laptop they barely used. She typed "driving schools near me" into the search bar, each letter feeling heavier than the last. Names and phone numbers filled the screen, rows of options she had always ignored, assuming they weren't for her. Her heart pounded so loudly she almost closed the computer, almost pretended she hadn't gone this far. Instead, she clicked on one that mentioned patient instructors and adult beginners, and felt a strange rush of courage. Before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed the number, listening to the ring as if it were counting down her old life. A woman answered, voice warm and practical, asking how she could help. Helen heard herself say the words, surprising even herself with how steady they sounded. "I'm 50, and I've never driven," she said. I think I'm ready to learn." As the woman began explaining schedules and availability, Helen felt something shift deep inside her, a small but undeniable turning of the wheel. Helen arrived at the driving school 15 minutes early, her palms already damp despite the cool morning air. The parking lot was nearly empty, the painted lines bright against the cracked pavement. She sat in her car seat, waiting for the instructor, trying to steady her breathing as the minutes ticked by. Every car that passed made her heart jump, afraid it might be the one signaling her turn to try. When a silver sedan pulled up beside her, she felt the ground of her life shift slightly. A woman stepped out, tall and calm, with a warm smile that reached her eyes before her mouth. "Hi, you must be Helen," she said, extending a hand that felt steady and reassuring. "My name's Carla. We'll take it slow today, no pressure, I promise." Helen nodded, grateful for the gentleness, though her voice felt trapped in her throat. They walked toward the training car together, sunlight glinting softly off the windshield. Inside the car, Helen sank into the driver's seat for the first time in decades, feeling the unfamiliar weight of responsibility. The steering wheel felt colder than she expected, smooth beneath her trembling fingers. Carla adjusted the seat and mirrors with practiced ease, explaining each step with patient clarity. Helen tried to follow, but every adjustment seemed to amplify her nervousness, her pulse thudding loudly in her ears. Still, she repeated the motions, as if learning to inhabit a new body. When the engine started, the quiet hum sent a jolt through her chest unlike anything she'd felt before. It wasn't fear exactly, but something sharper, a mix of awe and disbelief that this machine waited on her command. Carla guided her through the pedals, letting her practice the gentle press of her foot on the brake. Helen watched her own leg tremble as it moved, feeling both childish and ancient at once. The air inside the car held a charged stillness, like the moment before a first step. They began with the simplest motion, easing forward a few feet, then stopping. The car lurched slightly on her first try, and Helen felt heat rush to her cheeks. "It's okay," Carla said lightly. "Everyone does that at first. Try again." Helen exhaled shakily and pressed the pedal with more awareness this time. When the car rolled forward smoothly, a tiny spark of pride flickered inside her. They practiced slow circles around the empty lot, Carla offering soft corrections as needed. Helen's shoulders ached from how tightly she held herself, but she kept going, breath after breath. Each small movement of the wheel felt monumental, like rewriting a sentence she had believed all her life. Occasionally she caught herself smiling, surprised by the unfamiliar feeling blooming in her chest. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled the entire space. By the end of the lesson, her body was exhausted, but her mind felt strangely open. Carla handed her a small brochure and said, "You're doing better than you think." Helen didn't fully believe it yet, but she held on to the words like a fragile seed. As she walked back to Mark's car, her steps felt different, hesitant, but fuller somehow. For the first time, she sensed a door cracking open where she had expected only walls. That evening, Helen prepared dinner early, hoping the small victory of her lesson might soften the night ahead. She chopped vegetables with unusual focus, replaying Carla's instructions in her mind. But as soon as Mark walked in, the air shifted. She felt his mood before he said a word. He tossed his keys onto the counter and blinked at the sight of her cooking from scratch. "What's all this?" he asked, suspicion edging his tone instead of curiosity. "I had some time today," she said carefully, stirring the pot to avoid his eyes. Mark opened the refrigerator, scanning the shelves as if something were missing. "So you finally went to the store," he muttered, unaware of the deeper truth behind her calm expression. Helen hesitated, then said softly, "I also had my first driving lesson today." The words hung between them, fragile and hopeful, waiting for a place to land. Mark turned to her with a frown, the kind that stretched disbelief into irritation. "A driving lesson? Now, at your age?" Helen braced herself, but the blow landed harder than she expected, hollowing her chest. "I just thought it was time," she said, though her voice wavered at the end. He shook his head, half laughing, half scolding, as if she'd told a childish joke. "Driving isn't something you just pick up for fun," he continued, pulling out plates mechanically. "It's stressful, dangerous, you get anxious easily. Why put yourself through that?" Helen swallowed, feeling the familiar instinct to shrink, to agree, to smooth things over. But behind that old reflex pulsed the memory of the car moving under her control. That tiny moment of forward motion glimmered like a shield she didn't yet know how to hold. She wanted to tell him how afraid she'd been on the sidewalk, how helpless she'd felt. She wanted to say she was tired of depending on others for the simplest freedom, but every sentence she rehearsed turned to vapor before reaching her lips. Mark's doubt seeped through the room, settling into her bones like dampness. His voice echoed old beliefs she thought she had left behind, whispering that she wasn't capable. Still, something stubborn pressed back, quiet but steady. She remembered Carla's voice telling her she was doing better than she realized. She remembered the engine humming beneath her hands, waiting for her next move, and she remembered how small her world had felt before deciding to try. Those memories kept her from giving up, even as Mark dismissed her effort. After dinner, while he watched TV in the living room, Helen washed dishes slowly. Bubbles clung to her wrists, warm water soothing the tension in her arms. Her gaze drifted to the window, where night pressed gently against the glass. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I'm not stopping, not this time." And though the words were soft, they steadied her in a way nothing else had all day. Helen arrived early for her second lesson, determined not to let doubt drown out the trace of excitement she felt. Carla greeted her with the same warm energy, sensing the storm still lingering in Helen's expression. "Rough day?" she asked gently, but didn't push when Helen only gave a small nod. Instead, she patted the roof of the car and said, "Let's get back to it." The invitation felt like a lifeline, and Helen grabbed it willingly. As soon as she sat behind the wheel, her muscles tensed, but not as painfully as before. She adjusted her mirrors with more confidence, remembering each step without prompting. Carla watched her quietly, pride flickering in her eyes, but held back with humility. "Look at you," she said softly. "You've already changed since last time." Helen tried to hide the smile that tugged at her lips but failed. They practiced starting and stopping again, but the car responded more smoothly this time. Her movements were still tentative, but they carried a new intention, a quiet resolve. Carla introduced gentle turns next, guiding her hands on the wheel with calm precision. The world outside seemed to slow down, reduced to manageable shapes and distances. Helen felt a surprising swell of trust in her own body, something she hadn't felt in years. Half an hour into the lesson, Carla suggested they try driving along the empty service road behind the school. The idea sent a jolt through Helen, half fear, half exhilaration. She nodded, unsure whether she was brave or foolish, but unwilling to back out. When the car rolled from the parking lot onto the narrow road, the world opened before her. The moment felt almost unreal, like stepping into a life she'd once imagined but never claimed. She kept her speed slow, hands tight on the wheel, eyes scanning every inch of the road. But the car kept moving, steady under her guidance, and something inside her lifted. For the first time, driving didn't feel like a performance of bravery, it felt like belonging. Each second she remained in control, chipped away at the belief that she was incapable. By the time she reached the end of the road, she was breathing easier than she had in days. Carla asked her to turn around, and Helen did so carefully, her foot trembling only slightly. They drove the stretch again, and this time the car felt lighter, almost eager. The breeze through the cracked window carried hints of coastal air and distant pine. Helen felt a warmth spread through her chest, delicate but powerful. It was the feeling of proving something to herself she didn't know she deserved. When they parked at the end of the lesson, Helen sat in silence for a long moment. Her hands rested on the wheel, no longer shaking, grounded and sure. Carla touched her shoulder lightly and said, "That was real progress today." Those words rooted themselves inside Helen like a small anchor of hope. As she walked to her own car, she felt taller, steadier, a quiet victory humming through her. The next lesson began with a bright sky and a quiet confidence Helen hadn't expected to feel. Carla suggested they practice entering light traffic, just a single right turn into a calm street. Helen's heart thudded, but she agreed, wanting to meet this new challenge head-on. She checked her mirrors, signaled, and waited for a clear opening like she'd been taught. But as a car approached faster than she anticipated, her nerves began to fray. When she finally pressed the gas, her foot jerked with panic, sending the car forward too quickly. She corrected too hard, the wheel jerking right, tires bumping the edge of the curb. The sudden motion rattled her whole body, her pulse exploding in her throat. A horn blared behind her, sharp and accusatory, piercing through the thin layer of courage she'd built. Her vision blurred, and the humiliation struck deeper than fear. Carla reached out calmly, placing a steadying hand near the wheel without taking control. "It's okay, Helen. Breathe. You're all right," she said, voice firm but warm. Helen tried, but her breaths came out choppy, uneven, trembling like her hands. "I messed up," she whispered, her voice breaking down the center. "It happens to everyone," Carla insisted, "especially when they're learning. This doesn't define you." But the words couldn't stop the old stories from roaring back in her mind. The ones that said she wasn't capable, that she was foolish for trying so late in life. The ones that sounded eerily like Mark's skepticism from the night before. Her chest tightened with the weight of disappointment, heavy and familiar. She stared straight ahead, feeling her confidence dissolve into something sharp and painful. Carla guided her to pull over safely, letting the engine idle while Helen steadied herself. The world outside kept moving, joggers passing, cars humming, life continuing without shame. But inside the car, Helen felt suspended in a fog of self-doubt, unable to move. She pressed her fingertips to her forehead, trying to hold herself together. "I should quit," she murmured, barely audible. Carla shook her head slowly, firmly. "No, you had one rough moment. That's not a reason to stop, it's a reason to keep going." Helen met her eyes, searching for judgment but finding only quiet conviction. "You're not failing," Carla added. "You're learning. There's a difference." Something about that truth cut through the fog, but didn't clear it completely. The lesson resumed, gentler this time. No more traffic, just slow circles to regain her rhythm. Helen followed mechanically, the earlier confidence replaced by fragile caution. Her hands steadied eventually, but the bruise inside her didn't fade. She finished the session feeling small again. The earlier victory overshadowed. As she got out of the car, she whispered a shaky thank you, unsure if she meant it. Driving home with Mark's car, she felt the sting rise again, sharp and uninvited. The sky that morning had seemed full of possibilities, but now looked painfully ordinary. Her mistake repeated in her mind like a loop she couldn't pause. Every honk, every jolt, every flicker of fear replayed with cruel clarity. She wondered if maybe she had reached too far for something that wasn't hers to hold. When Helen arrived for her next lesson, her steps were slow, uncertain, as if each one asked whether she should keep going. Carla noticed the heaviness in her posture before Helen even spoke a word. They sat in the parked car without turning the key, sunlight warming the dashboard. "I almost didn't come today," Helen admitted, her voice thin and ashamed. Carla nodded, not surprised, not judgmental, simply present. "I want to tell you something," Carla said, folding her hands in her lap. "When I was 45, I left a marriage that had chipped away at me for years." Helen blinked, startled by the unexpected vulnerability. "I felt too old to start over," Carla continued, too tired, too scared, too used to disappearing. She turned to Helen with a soft, steady gaze that held more truth than any lesson so far. "The day I walked into my first mechanic class, surrounded by people half my age, I almost ran out crying," she said. "I didn't think I belonged, didn't think I was capable, didn't think anyone would take me seriously." Helen felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly, replaced by something warm. "But I stayed. I stayed because I knew the life I had was too small for who I really was," Carla said. "And learning something new saved me, one shaky step at a time." Silence settled between them, not heavy now, but meaningful, like soil ready for planting. Helen looked down at her trembling hands, seeing them in a new light. She wasn't the only one who had wanted more from life, even past the years people called too late. Maybe starting now didn't make her foolish. Maybe it made her brave. Maybe fear wasn't a stop sign, but a doorway. Carla touched the keys and finally started the engine, the hum gentle and reassuring. "Let's try again," she said. "Not to be perfect, just to keep going." Helen nodded, feeling the echo of those words settled deep inside her. They pulled out of the lot slowly, the road unfolding patiently before them, and for the first time since her mistake, Helen felt the possibility of trying without punishing herself. As they practiced, Carla kept her instructions soft, calm, letting Helen rebuild trust in her movements. Each turn came a little easier, each stop a little smoother, each breath a little steadier. Helen felt her confidence forming again, not as a sudden surge, but as a quiet returning. It felt different now, rooted not in perfection, but in perseverance. She realized she could move forward even with trembling hands. By the end of the lesson, Helen no longer felt like she was fighting herself. The fear was still there, but it didn't swallow her. It simply rode beside her, manageable. Carla parked the car and said softly, "You didn't quit. That's the biggest win." Helen looked at the steering wheel, then at the open sky through the windshield, and for the first time, she believed that she might actually belong behind the wheel someday. She left the school with a quieter heart, one that beat with bruised but growing courage. The world outside looked the same, but something inside her had shifted again. She understood now that progress didn't erase fear, it walked with it. What mattered was continuing, choosing herself one small moment at a time. As she drove home, the whisper inside her said not "I can't," but "maybe I can." The morning sun cast long strips of gold across Helen's dashboard as she sat parked outside the driving school. Carla smiled as she approached, a knowing look in her eyes that signaled a new step forward. "Ready for something different today?" she asked, leaning slightly against the door. Helen felt the flutter of fear and anticipation rise together inside her chest. She nodded slowly, gripping the wheel, as though anchoring herself to the moment. They drove out of the parking lot and onto a quiet neighborhood street lined with magnolia trees. The branches arched overhead like a gentle canopy, filtering sunlight through glossy leaves. Helen breathed in the subtle scent drifting through the open window, grounding herself in the present. Her hands trembled at first, but steadied as she matched her breath to the car's movement. The road felt alive beneath her, a calm invitation rather than a threat. Carla guided her toward a destination Helen hadn't expected, a small park she used to visit with her children. The sight of the old wooden sign stirred a swirl of memories she hadn't felt in years. Picnics on patchy blankets, toddlers wobbling toward playground swings, Mark laughing freely back then. The past flickered vividly, filling her with a blend of tenderness and quiet grief. Driving toward that place made her feel as though she were steering through time itself. She parked near the row of benches by the pond, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Helen stared at the familiar path where her children once chased ducks with breathless joy. The younger version of herself appeared in her mind, busy, tired, hopeful. unaware of how much she would lose. The ache was gentle but deep, like touching a long-healed bruise. For a moment she wondered where that woman had gone, or if she was still hidden inside her somewhere. "Want to walk a little?" Carla asked, breaking the silence with kindness. Helen nodded and stepped out, feeling the soft crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. The pond glimmered under the sun, ripples spreading with quiet purpose across its surface. They walked slowly, neither speaking, letting the place fill the silence. Helen felt something shift, a recognition that this journey wasn't only about driving. This route had brought her face to face with the parts of herself she thought she'd left behind. Every turn had carried her closer to truths she avoided for years. She wasn't just learning to drive, she was learning to return to herself. The road back to her strength, her identity, her voice had begun here. She felt the weight of that realization settle inside her like steady roots. When they returned to the car, Helen touched the door handle with renewed resolve. "You did beautifully today," Carla said, her voice warm and full. Helen let out a long breath, one that seemed to expel years of hidden tension. "I didn't think I could come back here," she murmured, surprised by her own honesty. Carla nodded gently and replied, "Sometimes the hardest roads are the ones that lead us home." That evening, the house felt unusually quiet, as though preparing itself for something heavy. Helen's heart pounded as she placed her bag on the kitchen counter and found Mark waiting. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, his expression already set with disapproval. "Where have you been?" he asked, voice edged with suspicion rather than curiosity. Helen forced herself to breathe steadily, knowing this moment had been building for weeks. "I was at my lesson," she said simply, though her voice carried a tremor of truth. Mark shook his head, exhaling sharply, as if exhausted by the topic. "Helen, this has gone far enough. You're not thinking straight." He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though delivering a practical warning. "You're 50 years old. This isn't the time to reinvent yourself with childish fantasies." Her stomach tightened as his words echoed the fears she had fought so hard to quiet. But beneath the sting, something solid began to rise, a strength she hadn't expected to feel. "For years I believed that," she said softly, lifting her chin. "I believed I couldn't change, couldn't want more, couldn't take up space." Her voice steadied as she added, "But that belief nearly erased me." Mark's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with anger. "What are you talking about? You have a perfectly good life." Helen looked around the kitchen, clean counters, folded towels, a life she had held together alone. "Good for who?" she whispered, her eyes filling but her voice strong. "For you, for the kids, for everyone but me." He opened his mouth to argue, but she raised a hand, stopping him for the first time in years. "I need this," she said, feeling the truth resonate through every word. "Not to drive somewhere to find myself again." Her hands shook, but she didn't back down, didn't soften the edges this time. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you who I'm becoming." The silence that followed was thick, stretching like a taut rope between them. Mark looked away, jaw clenching, trying to regain the ground he felt slipping. Finally, he muttered, "Do whatever you want," before turning sharply toward the living room. The dismissal hurt, but it didn't break her. It only confirmed what she already knew. She wasn't fighting him, she was choosing herself, even if he didn't understand. Helen stood alone in the kitchen, breathing through the storm that had finally burst. Her heart throbbed, her palms were damp, her throat tight with emotion. But underneath the trembling, a quiet liberation began to bloom. She had spoken the truth out loud, not in whispers, not in secret, and that truth had reshaped the room around her, making space for who she was becoming. The morning of the test arrived with a cool breeze and a pale, steady light across the sky. Helen stood outside the DMV building, clutching her paperwork with trembling hands. Carla joined her, offering a reassuring smile and a thermos of warm tea. "You've earned this moment," she said gently, squeezing Helen's shoulder. Helen swallowed hard, feeling both ready and terrified. Inside the test car, the seat felt unfamiliar despite all her practice. Her breath came shallow at first, the world narrowing to the steering wheel and pedals. The examiner introduced himself, his tone neutral but not unkind. He listed the rules, the checkpoints, the expectations, with calm clarity. Helen nodded, every word settling like weight on her shoulders. As she turned the ignition, the familiar hum of the engine steadied her heartbeat. She remembered the empty parking lot, the service road, the tremors of her early lessons. She remembered the mistake that nearly made her quit and the story that brought her back. And she remembered the sidewalk where this journey had truly begun. Those memories layered into a strange strength inside her. They started with simple maneuvers, and Helen followed each instruction carefully. Her hands were tense but precise, her eyes scanning with focused intent. Every turn felt like a small echo of the person she used to be and the person she was becoming. The examiner watched quietly, marking notes on his clipboard without comment. The silence made her nervous, but she kept going, breath by breath. Halfway through, they approached the right turn that had haunted her since her mistake. Her pulse spiked, but she forced her breath slow, recalling Carla's voice. Not perfect, persistent. She checked her mirrors, signaled, waited patiently for the opening. When she finally turned, the motion was smooth, steady, deeply intentional. The moment passed without incident, but inside her, something huge unlocked. The rest of the test unfolded with careful concentration, each step a quiet victory. When they returned to the DMV lot, Helen parked with only a slight tremor in her hands. The examiner clicked his pen, paused, then finally looked at her. "You passed," he said plainly, as if announcing something ordinary. But to Helen, the words felt like a sunrise breaking open inside her chest. Tears blurred her vision as she stepped out of the car, meeting Carla waiting nearby. She didn't need to say anything. Carla saw everything in her face. They embraced, a tight, grateful hug filled with shared triumph. The world around her seemed wider than it had ever been. For the first time in decades, Helen felt truly, undeniably free. The license still felt unreal as Helen held it between her fingers, studying the tiny photograph. It wasn't the picture that moved her, but what it represented. Every mile of courage she'd fought for. Carla beamed proudly beside her, clapping her lightly on the back. "You earned every bit of this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Helen nodded, overwhelmed by gratitude she couldn't fully express. When she got home, the house felt unfamiliar, as if she had returned as someone slightly different. Mark sat on the couch, glancing up briefly when she walked in. She held the license lightly, waiting to see if he noticed, if he cared. He stared for a moment, confusion flickering across his face. Then he simply muttered, "Congratulations," before turning back to the television. The lukewarm response hurt, but it didn't diminish the glow inside her. Instead, it clarified something essential. Her worth wasn't tied to his recognition. She walked to their bedroom, opened the small jewelry dish where she kept her treasured things. Carefully, she placed the license there, like a relic of a personal resurrection. Her hands lingered above it, trembling with pride rather than fear. Later, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The house felt like a museum of her old life, every object frozen in its expected place. But she no longer matched the static rhythm of these rooms. She had changed shape. Her world, once confined by walls and waiting, had widened beyond measure. She felt a pull toward something new, something outside routine and resignation. She stepped outside, letting the crisp evening air brush against her skin. The street was still, porch lights glowing softly, magnolia trees rustling faintly above. She imagined herself behind the wheel at this very moment, choosing a direction without permission. The thought filled her with a rush of certainty that felt almost electric. This wasn't just a skill she'd gained, it was a life she had reclaimed. She returned inside and stood before the mirror, studying her own reflection. Lines framed her eyes, the marks of years spent giving more than she kept. But beneath them was a brightness she hadn't seen in years, a presence fully awake. She lifted her chin, recognizing the woman looking back at her. The key wasn't just in her hand, it was in her becoming. The next morning, Helen woke before sunrise, an unfamiliar excitement fluttering in her chest. The house was still, wrapped in soft shadows that stretched across the floor. She dressed quietly, her hands steady as she reached for her bag and keys. The license sat in her wallet like a small, glowing truth she could finally claim. Today, she wasn't waiting for anyone. She was choosing her own beginning. Outside, the sky shifted from deep navy to pale gold, the world waking gently around her. She slid into the driver's seat, inhaling the crisp air tinged with salt from the distant coast. Her fingers lingered on the key before turning it, the engine humming to life. The sound filled her with a sense of belonging she had never known before. She whispered, "It's just me now," and let the words steady her. She drove through quiet streets, passing familiar houses that now seemed smaller somehow. The city stretched around her like an old map she was learning to read anew. Every traffic light, Every curve, every passing tree felt like part of a quiet celebration. Her heart beat in rhythm with each mile, the world expanding with her courage. With every turn, she shed another layer of the life that had held her still. As she approached the highway, the sky burst into hues of rose and bright amber. She took a deep breath, signaling and merging with deliberate grace. The wind whispered through the cracked window, carrying the scent of sea breeze. Helen felt the sun warming her cheeks, igniting something bright inside her. She wasn't scared now, she was alive in a way she hadn't been in years. She reached the coastline just as the sun peaked above the horizon. Parking near the empty beach, she stepped out, feeling sand crunch under her shoes. Waves rolled in steady rhythms, washing away the night, one breath at a time. Helen walked toward the water, letting the wind wrap gently around her. She lifted her face to the sky, exhaling the years she had once buried. Standing at the edge of the ocean, she felt both small and immeasurably powerful. She understood now that the journey hadn't been about driving at all. It had been about reclaiming a life she had slowly handed away, piece by piece. Every fear faced, every mile driven had returned her to her own center. The horizon stretched ahead, mirroring the open road inside her. Helen closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on her skin. She whispered a quiet promise to herself, not of perfection, but of presence. She would continue choosing the road, choosing movement, choosing courage, because rebirthing wasn't a moment. It was a continuous unfolding. And as the first full light of morning touched her, she finally stepped into her new life.